Welcome to the captivating world of the Merovingian Dynasty, the long-haired kings who shaped the early medieval history of Western Europe. Rising from the fragmented post-Roman landscape, the Merovingians ruled over a diverse and dynamic realm, blending Germanic custom with Roman heritage, sacred kingship with practical governance, and martial prowess with ritual authority. This series delves deep into their political strategies, legal innovations, religious patronage, cultural influence, and the enduring legacy they left in shaping European society. From the legendary reign of Clovis I to the final ceremonial kings overshadowed by the Carolingians, the Merovingians offer a remarkable lens into how power, memory, and belief intertwine to construct one of Europe's foundational dynasties. Journey through centuries of intrigue, adaptation, and cultural synthesis as we explore the dynasty whose impact resonates long after the last long-haired king disappeared from the throne. The Merovingian dynasty emerged from the shadowy intersection of legend and history during the collapse of Roman authority in Western Europe, forming one of the earliest and most influential royal houses of medieval Europe, ruling over large parts of what would later become France and Western Germany from the late 5th to the mid-8th century. And its origins were inseparably tied to the transformation of the ancient world into the medieval one, as Roman administrative structures disintegrated and new Germanic powers rose to fill the vacuum, creating a dynamic and often violent landscape in which kingship was personal, sacred, and deeply intertwined with warfare and kinship. The dynasty took its name from Merovec, a semi-legendary Frankish leader said to have lived in the mid-5th century, whose birth was surrounded by myth, including stories that he was conceived through a supernatural encounter with a sea creature, a tale that symbolized the belief that Merovingian kings possessed a divine or magical quality that set them apart from ordinary warriors, a belief reinforced by the long hair worn by Merovingian rulers, which functioned as a sacred symbol of royal power, with the cutting of a king's hair representing not merely humiliation but the complete loss of legitimacy. Although Merovec himself remains historically elusive, his supposed descendant Childeric I is firmly grounded in the historical record, having ruled the Salian Franks in the region of Tournai during the late Roman period, acting at times as both an ally and a rival of Roman authorities, commanding Frankish warbands while navigating the complex politics of a crumbling empire. And his burial, discovered in the 17th century, revealed a striking blend of Roman and Germanic elements, including imperial insignia alongside traditional Frankish weapons and symbols, illustrating the hybrid world from which the Merovingian state emerged. Childeric's son, Clovis I, stands as the true founder of the Merovingian kingdom and one of the most consequential rulers in European history, for through a combination of military genius, ruthless ambition, and shrewd political calculation, he unified the Frankish tribes under his rule and laid the foundations of a powerful monarchy that would dominate Gaul for generations. Clovis came to power around 481 CE at a young age and quickly embarked on a series of campaigns that expanded his authority, defeating rival Frankish leaders and conquering Roman-controlled territories, most notably his victory over the Roman commander Syagrius at the Battle of Soissons in 486, which effectively ended Roman rule in northern Gaul and transferred its lands, cities, and administrative structures into Frankish hands, allowing Clovis to inherit not only territory but also Roman traditions of governance that would profoundly shape his kingdom. Even more significant than his military victories was Clovis's conversion to Nicene Christianity, traditionally dated to around 496 following his victory over the Alemanni at the Battle of Tolbiac, a moment later celebrated by Christian writers as divinely inspired, though in reality it was also a masterstroke of political strategy. For by embracing the Catholic faith rather than Arian Christianity, which was followed by many other Germanic rulers, Clovis aligned himself with the powerful Gallo-Roman clergy and the majority of the local population, securing their support and granting his rule a powerful aura of religious legitimacy. His baptism by Bishop Remigius of Reims became a foundational myth of French monarchy, later invoked for centuries to portray France as the eldest daughter of the Church, and it established a close relationship between the Frankish kings and the Church that would define medieval European politics. Clovis's reign was marked not only by expansion but also by brutal consolidation, as he eliminated rivals through assassination and deception, including members of his own extended family, actions that shocked contemporaries but were justified within the violent norms of the age as necessary steps toward unity and stability. By the time of his death in 511, Clovis ruled a vast kingdom stretching from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, but his greatest weakness lay in the Frankish tradition of partible inheritance, under which a king's realm was divided equally among his sons rather than passed intact to a single heir, a practice that would repeatedly fracture the Merovingian state and fuel cycles of civil war that defined much of its history. Upon Clovis's death, his kingdom was divided among his 4 sons, Theoderic, Clodomir, Childebert and Clothar, creating sub-kingdoms centered on cities such as Reims, Orleans, Paris and Soissons. And although these brothers occasionally cooperated, particularly in campaigns against external enemies like the Burgundians, their relationships were marked by rivalry, betrayal and violence, including the infamous murder of Clodomir's young sons by their uncles, an act that underscored the ruthless nature of Merovingian politics and the precarious position of royal children. Over the following decades, the Merovingian realms were repeatedly divided and reunited as kings died, heirs were born, and ambitious relatives seized opportunities to expand their power, creating a constantly shifting political map in which loyalty was personal rather than institutional and power rested on a king's ability to reward followers with land, booty, and protection. Despite this instability, the Merovingian kings presided over a society in transition, in which Roman urban life, legal traditions, and Christian institutions persisted alongside Germanic customs, oral law, and warrior culture, producing a distinctive Frankish civilization that blended old and new elements. Merovingian law codes, such as the Salic law, were written down during this period, reflecting an effort to codify customary practices while adapting them to a Christian framework, and these laws reveal a society deeply concerned with kinship, honor, and compensation, where crimes were often resolved through fines rather than imprisonment, and social status determined the value of a person's life in legal terms. The Church played an increasingly central role in Merovingian society, not only as a spiritual authority but also as a major landowner and political actor, with bishops often serving as royal advisors, diplomats, and administrators, and monasteries becoming centers of learning, economic activity, and cultural preservation in an age of limited literacy. Yet the relationship between kings and the Church was not always harmonious, as Merovingian rulers frequently interfered in ecclesiastical appointments and used church resources to reward supporters, leading to tensions that reflected broader struggles over power and authority. As the dynasty progressed into the 7th century, the weaknesses inherent in its structure became more pronounced, as successive generations of kings inherited diminished authority, while real power increasingly shifted into the hands of the mayors of the palace, originally royal household officials responsible for managing estates and overseeing servants, who gradually transformed into the chief administrators and military leaders of the realm, often acting as the effective rulers behind the throne. This process was exacerbated by the frequent accession of child kings, whose youth made them dependent on regents and powerful nobles, and by the growing influence of aristocratic families who controlled vast lands and commanded private armies, eroding the king's ability to govern independently. The later Merovingian kings were derisively labeled the Roisfanians, or do-nothing kings, by later chroniclers, particularly those writing under the succeeding Carolingian dynasty, a characterization that, while exaggerated and politically motivated, reflects a real decline in royal initiative and authority during the final century of Merovingian rule. Nevertheless, the Merovingian period was far from a time of stagnation, as it witnessed significant cultural, religious, and economic developments, including the continued Christianization of rural areas, the expansion of monastic networks, the circulation of gold coinage in the earlier phase and silver in the later period, and the maintenance of long-distance trade connections linking Gaul to the Mediterranean world and beyond. The artistic culture of the Merovingians, though often overlooked, produced distinctive forms of metalwork, jewelry, and manuscript illumination, characterized by intricate designs, symbolic motifs, and a fusion of Roman, Christian, and Germanic styles, reflecting the complex identity of a society poised between antiquity and the Middle Ages. By the early 8th century, however, the balance of power had decisively shifted away from the Merovingian kings, as the Carolingian mayors of the palace, most notably Charles Martel, exercised de facto control over the Frankish realms, commanding armies, distributing lands, and shaping policy while leaving the kings as ceremonial figures whose long hair and ancient lineage symbolized a past glory rather than present authority. This gradual eclipse of Merovingian power set the stage for the dynasty's eventual fall, but the legacy of the Merovingians endured long after their political dominance ended, for they had created the first durable Frankish kingdom, forged a lasting alliance between monarchy and the Catholic Church, and established patterns of rule, law, and culture that would shape the development of medieval Europe, making their story not merely one of decline and replacement, but of transformation, continuity, and foundation, a story that begins in myth and bloodshed and unfolds into the complex reality of early medieval kingship, setting the groundwork for the rise of new dynasties and the emergence of a distinctly European political order. The second phase of the Merovingian dynasty unfolds as a prolonged struggle between inherited sacred kingship and the practical realities of governing an increasingly complex Frankish world, a period in which the dynasty's outward splendor masked deep internal fractures, while new centers of power steadily emerged beneath the surface of royal ritual and tradition. Following the death of Clovis's sons and the repeated partitions of the Frankish realms, the kingdom entered a cycle of division and reunification that became almost rhythmic, as brothers ruled together uneasily, nephews challenged uncles, and cousins fought cousins, each conflict justified by blood right and sanctified by custom, yet each one weakening the coherence of royal authority. By the mid-6th century, the Frankish world had crystallized into three principal regions: Austrasia in the east, Neustria in the west, and Burgundy in the south, each with its own political culture, aristocratic networks, and strategic priorities. And although these regions were theoretically united under the Merovingian royal house, in practice they often functioned as semi-independent realms whose rulers competed for supremacy. Kings such as Clovis I briefly restored unity through conquest and elimination of rivals, but their achievements proved temporary, for the structural forces that encouraged fragmentation remained unchanged, ensuring that unity would dissolve again upon their deaths. The brutality of Merovingian politics during this era was epitomized by the famous feud between Queen Brunhilde of Austrasia and Queen Fredegund of Neustria, two formidable women whose rivalry dominated Frankish politics for decades and revealed both the possibilities and perils of female power in a dynastic system defined by male lineage. Brunhilde, a Visigothic princess married into the Merovingian family, sought to strengthen royal authority and promote Roman-style administration, while Fredegund, of more humble origins, relied on intrigue, assassination, and ruthless manipulation to secure power for herself and her son, and their conflict plunged the kingdom into repeated wars, assassinations, and vendettas that devastated regions and entrenched aristocratic militarism. The eventual capture and execution of Brunhilde in 613, after a long and tragic career marked by ambition and reform, symbolized both the end of an era and the triumph of a new political reality, as Clovis II of Neustria emerged as the sole ruler of the Frankish kingdoms, uniting them once more but at the cost of conceding significant authority to the nobility. Clovis II's reign marked a turning point in Merovingian history, for although he restored nominal unity, he did so by formalizing the power of regional elites, most notably through the Edict of Paris in 614, which confirmed the rights of local aristocrats and bishops, restricted royal interference in regional affairs, and effectively acknowledged that kingship could no longer operate as an unchecked personal authority. This edict, often interpreted as a concession forced upon a weakened monarchy, represented a crucial shift in governance, as power became more decentralized and institutionalized within aristocratic and ecclesiastical structures, laying the groundwork for the later feudal order. Under Clovis II and his son Dagobert I, the Merovingian monarchy experienced its last significant revival, particularly during Dagobert's reign from 629 to 639, which was remembered by later generations as a golden age of Merovingian rule. Dagobert I ruled energetically, asserted royal authority over both Neustria and Austrasia, patronized the church, founded the great abbey of St. Denis as a royal burial site, and maintained diplomatic relations with distant powers, including Byzantium and even the Islamic Caliphate, demonstrating that the Frankish kingdom remained integrated into a wider Eurasian world. He also attempted to curb the power of the aristocracy and the mayors of the palace, seeking to reassert the king's role as supreme judge and military leader. But despite his efforts, the forces eroding royal authority proved stronger than any single ruler. After Dagobert's death, the Merovingian kingship entered its final phase, characterized by the succession of weak or underage kings who reigned in name while effective power slipped decisively into the hands of the mayors of the palace, particularly in Austrasia, where the aristocracy had long valued strong military leadership and collective governance over centralized royal control. These mayors, drawn from powerful noble families, became the real architects of Frankish policy, commanding armies, negotiating alliances, and distributing lands, while the kings performed ceremonial functions, presided over rituals, and embodied the sacred continuity of the dynasty. The eventual capture and execution of Brunhilde in 613, after a long and tragic career marked by ambition and reform, symbolized both the end of an era and the triumph of a new political reality, as Clovis II of Neustria emerged as the sole ruler of the Frankish kingdoms, uniting them once more but at the cost of conceding significant authority to the nobility. Clovis II's reign marked a turning point in Merovingian history, for although he restored nominal unity, he did so by formalizing the power of regional elites, most notably through the Edict of Paris in 614, which confirmed the rights of local aristocrats and bishops, restricted royal interference in regional affairs, and effectively acknowledged that kingship could no longer operate as an unchecked personal authority. This edict, often interpreted as a concession forced upon a weakened monarchy, represented a crucial shift in governance, as power became more decentralized and institutionalized within aristocratic and ecclesiastical structures, laying the groundwork for the later feudal order. Under Clovis II and his son Dagobert I, the Merovingian monarchy experienced its last significant revival, particularly during Dagobert's reign from 629 to 639, which was remembered by later generations as a golden age of Merovingian rule. Dagobert I ruled energetically, asserted royal authority over both Neustria and Austrasia, patronized the church, founded the great abbey of St. Denis as a royal burial site, and maintained diplomatic relations with distant powers, including Byzantium and even the Islamic Caliphate, demonstrating that the Frankish kingdom remained integrated into a wider Eurasian world. He also attempted to curb the power of the aristocracy and the mayors of the palace, seeking to reassert the king's role as supreme judge and military leader. But despite his efforts, the forces eroding royal authority proved stronger than any single ruler. After Dagobert's death, the Merovingian kingship entered its final phase, characterized by the succession of weak or underage kings who reigned in name while effective power slipped decisively into the hands of the mayors of the palace, particularly in Austrasia, where the aristocracy had long valued strong military leadership and collective governance over centralized royal control. These mayors, drawn from powerful noble families, became the real architects of Frankish policy, commanding armies, negotiating alliances, and distributing lands, while the kings performed ceremonial functions, presided over rituals, and embodied the sacred continuity of the dynasty. The most important of these families was the lineage that would later be known as the Carolingians, beginning with figures such as Pepin of Landen and his descendants, who combined vast landholdings with military prowess and strategic marriages to build an unparalleled power base. This transformation did not occur overnight, nor was it universally acknowledged at the time, for Merovingian kings still mattered symbolically, and their presence was necessary to legitimize authority, but the balance of power had irreversibly shifted, creating a dual system in which kings reigned while mayors ruled. The cultural and social life of the Merovingian world during this period continued to evolve, reflecting both continuity with the Roman past and adaptation to new realities, as Latin remained the language of administration and the church, even as spoken vernaculars gradually diverged into early forms of Romance and Germanic dialects, and literacy, though limited, was preserved and transmitted through monastic scriptoria that copied religious texts, chronicles, and legal documents. Monasticism flourished under royal and aristocratic patronage, with monasteries serving not only as spiritual centers but also as engines of economic development, clearing land, organizing agriculture, and integrating rural populations into Christian life, while saints' cults became powerful focal points of local identity and devotion, often tied to royal or noble patronage. The Merovingian Church was deeply embedded in politics, as bishops acted as intermediaries between kings and local communities, wielded moral authority, and sometimes challenged royal actions, yet they were also deeply enmeshed in aristocratic networks, blurring the line between spiritual and secular power. Economically, the Frankish kingdoms experienced both contraction and adaptation, as long-distance trade networks inherited from the Roman world diminished but did not disappear, with Mediterranean luxury goods becoming rarer while regional trade intensified, and a shift from gold to silver coinage reflected changing economic conditions and sources of wealth. Rural estates became the backbone of the economy, controlled by kings, nobles, and monasteries, and the distribution of land in exchange for service became an increasingly important political tool, further empowering the aristocracy at the expense of royal authority. Law and justice during the later Merovingian period reveal a society striving for order amid fragmentation, as kings continued to issue capitularies and confirm laws, but enforcement depended heavily on local officials and noble cooperation, making justice uneven and often shaped by power relationships rather than abstract principles. Violence remained a constant feature of political life, yet it was increasingly regulated through oaths, compensation, and ecclesiastical mediation, reflecting the Church's growing influence in restraining, if not eliminating, endemic conflict. By the early 8th century, the Merovingian kings had become living symbols of an older conception of kingship, revered for their ancestry and sacred status but largely detached from the realities of governance, and their long hair, once a sign of potent authority, now seemed an archaic relic preserved to legitimize the actions of others. The rise of Charles Martel, mayor of the Palace of Austrasia, marked the final eclipse of Merovingian power, as he ruled without even bothering to appoint a king for several years, commanding Frankish forces, redistributing lands, and defending the realm against external threats, most famously halting the advance of Muslim forces at the Battle of Tours in 732, an event later magnified in historical memory as a defining moment for Christian Europe. Although Charles Martel never assumed the royal title, his dominance made clear that the Merovingian dynasty had become obsolete as a governing institution, surviving only because of tradition and the lingering belief in the sanctity of royal blood. The final Merovingian king, Childeric III, was little more than a figurehead, elevated and deposed at the will of the Carolingian mayors, until in 751 Pepin the Short, son of Charles Martel, took the decisive step of deposing Childeric, cutting his long hair, and consigning him to a monastery, an act that symbolically and practically ended Merovingian rule. This transition was carefully orchestrated with the support of the papacy, which sanctioned Pepin's kingship and in return gained a powerful protector, marking a new alliance between Frankish rulers and the Church that would culminate in the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne. The fall of the Merovingians was thus not a sudden collapse but the outcome of a long process of transformation, in which the nature of power, kingship, and legitimacy evolved in response to social, economic, and political pressures. Their legacy endured in the institutions they shaped, the laws they codified, the Christian identity they fostered, and the territorial foundations they established, making the Merovingian dynasty a crucial bridge between the ancient Roman world and the medieval European order, a dynasty whose decline illuminates the changing nature of authority itself, and whose story, when fully understood, reveals not merely the failure of kings but the birth of a new political system that would define Europe for centuries to come. The final exploration of the Merovingian dynasty must move beyond the narrative of kings and battles to examine the deeper structures, beliefs, and legacies that defined Merovingian rule and ensured its lasting influence long after the dynasty itself vanished from political power. For the true significance of the Merovingians lies not only in their dramatic rise and decline, but in the world they shaped and transmitted to their successors. Merovingian kingship was rooted in a conception of power that blended sacred authority, personal charisma, and military leadership, a model inherited from both late Roman imperial traditions and Germanic warrior culture, in which the king was simultaneously a war leader, a judge, a distributor of wealth, and a figure imbued with supernatural legitimacy. This sacred dimension of kingship, symbolized most visibly by the uncut hair of Merovingian rulers, reflected a belief that royal authority was inherent and almost physical, residing in the king's body and bloodline rather than in abstract institutions, and it was this belief that allowed even the weakest kings of the later period to retain symbolic importance long after their practical power had evaporated. Rituals of kingship, including enthronement ceremonies, gift-giving, and public judgments, reinforced this sacral status, while the association of kings with saints, relics, and holy places further blurred the line between religious and political authority. At the same time, Merovingian governance remained profoundly personal and decentralized, relying on networks of loyalty rather than bureaucratic systems. as royal officials such as counts and dukes exercised authority in the king's name but often acted autonomously, drawing power from their own landholdings and armed followers. This reliance on personal bonds made the kingdom resilient in some respects, allowing local governance to continue even during periods of dynastic chaos, but it also ensured that royal authority was fragile, constantly negotiated, and vulnerable to erosion by ambitious elites. The aristocracy that emerged under the Merovingians was not a fixed hereditary nobility in the later medieval sense, but a fluid elite defined by access to land, royal favor, military success, and strategic marriage, and it was within this competitive environment that families like the Carolingians rose to prominence by mastering the very mechanisms that had once sustained Merovingian power. The legal culture of the Merovingian world reveals much about its values and priorities, as law codes such as the Salic law and its regional variants sought to regulate violence, property, and inheritance in a society where honor and kinship were paramount, and justice was conceived less as punishment by the state than as the restoration of balance through compensation. These laws preserved older Germanic customs while adapting them to Christian moral frameworks, condemning practices such as blood feuds in theory even as they continued to shape behavior in practice, and they offer a window into a society negotiating the tension between tradition and reform. The Church played a crucial role in this process, acting as both a stabilizing force and an agent of change, as bishops and abbots promoted ideals of peace, charity, and moral order while also participating fully in the political struggles of the age. Merovingian rulers endowed churches and monasteries generously, motivated by genuine piety, the desire for spiritual intercession, and the practical benefits of alliance with a literate and influential institution, and in doing so they helped lay the foundations of a Christian landscape that would dominate medieval Europe. Monasteries such as Luxeuil, Corbie, and Saint Denis became centers of learning, artistic production, and economic organization, preserving classical texts, developing distinctive artistic styles, and reshaping the rural economy through large-scale land management. The cultural world of the Merovingians, though long dismissed as crude or primitive by later historians, was in fact rich and complex, characterized by a synthesis of Roman, Christian, and Germanic elements that found expression in architecture, art, and literature. Merovingian metalwork, with its intricate cloisonné designs, garnet inlays, and symbolic animal motifs, reflects a highly sophisticated aesthetic that conveyed status, identity, and belief, while manuscript illumination and stone carving reveal a gradual adaptation of classical forms to new purposes and sensibilities. Latin literary culture persisted in chronicles, saints' lives, and legal texts, even as it evolved to reflect new realities, and authors such as Gregory of Tours provide invaluable insight into the mental world of the Merovingian elite, a world in which miracles and divine judgment coexisted naturally with political calculation and brutal violence. Gregory's writings, while shaped by his own ecclesiastical perspective, illuminate the moral universe of the age, revealing how kings were judged not only by their success in war but by their support of the Church, their respect for holy men and women, and their ability to maintain peace and justice, however imperfectly. The economic foundations of Merovingian society further illustrate its transitional character, as the collapse of centralized Roman taxation gave way to a land-based economy in which wealth and power were rooted in control over estates, labor, and agricultural surplus. Kings derived income from royal lands, tolls, fines, and occasional tribute, but their ability to command resources depended heavily on cooperation from local elites, reinforcing the decentralized nature of governance. Trade networks continued to function, particularly along rivers such as the Rhine, Rhône, and Seine, linking the Frankish kingdoms to the Mediterranean and northern Europe, and archaeological evidence of imported goods demonstrates that the Merovingian world was far from isolated, participating in broader patterns of exchange that connected it to Byzantium, the British Isles, and the Islamic world. Socially, the Merovingian period was marked by sharp hierarchies but also by significant mobility, as individuals and families could rise through military service, clerical careers, or royal patronage, while others fell through political miscalculation or defeat, creating a dynamic and often unstable social order. Women, though excluded from formal kingship, exercised considerable influence as queens, regents, abbesses, and aristocrats, shaping politics through marriage alliances, patronage, and sometimes direct intervention, as seen in the careers of figures like Brunhilde and Balthild, whose lives demonstrate both the opportunities and dangers faced by powerful women in a male-dominated society. The decline of the Merovingian dynasty, when viewed from this broader perspective, appears less as a simple story of decay and incompetence and more as the outcome of structural transformations that rendered the old model of kingship increasingly untenable. As military organization, landholding patterns, and ecclesiastical influence evolved, effective power gravitated toward those who could mobilize resources, command loyalty, and act decisively, qualities embodied by the mayors of the palace and ultimately by the Carolingians, who did not reject Merovingian traditions so much as adapt and reconfigure them to suit new circumstances. The Carolingians preserved the alliance between kingship and the church, refined the use of land grants to secure loyalty, and reimagined royal authority in more explicitly moral and imperial terms, culminating in the coronation of Charlemagne as emperor, an event that would have been unthinkable without the precedents established by Merovingian rule. Yet even as the Carolingians reshaped the political landscape, the memory of the Merovingians endured, embedded in royal genealogies, saints' cults, and local traditions, and the very act of deposing the last Merovingian king required elaborate ritual and papal approval, underscoring the enduring power of Merovingian legitimacy. In this sense, the Merovingian dynasty did not simply vanish but was absorbed into the evolving fabric of medieval Europe, its institutions, laws, and cultural forms continuing to shape the societies that followed. The Merovingians stand as architects of a new order forged from the ruins of Rome, rulers who navigated an age of uncertainty with tools inherited from multiple traditions, and whose successes and failures illuminate the profound challenges of governance in a world undergoing fundamental transformation. Their story, when considered in its full complexity, reveals the emergence of medieval Europe not as a sudden break with the past but as a gradual contested process in which old and new coexisted, clashed, and ultimately fused, making the Merovingian dynasty not merely a prelude to greater empires but a central chapter in the long and intricate history of European civilization. The concluding segment of the Merovingian dynasty series must draw together the long threads of politics, society, memory, and historical interpretation to understand how the Merovingians were remembered, reimagined, and ultimately woven into the identity of medieval and modern Europe. For dynasties do not end when kings are deposed but continue to live in narratives, symbols, and institutions that shape later generations. After the fall of the last Merovingian king, the Carolingians deliberately recast Merovingian history to legitimize their own seizure of power, portraying the later Merovingian rulers as indolent, ineffective, and unworthy, a narrative most famously expressed in the label Royce-Fainéants, or do-nothing kings, which is echoed through centuries of historical writing and popular imagination. Yet this depiction was less an objective assessment than a political construction, designed to justify a revolutionary transfer of kingship by framing it as restoration rather than usurpation, and modern scholarship has increasingly challenged this caricature by emphasizing the structural constraints under which later Merovingian kings operated and the continuing importance of their symbolic authority. Even in their final decades, Merovingian kings remained essential to the functioning of power, for laws were still issued in their names, assemblies convened under their authority, and military campaigns nominally fought on their behalf, demonstrating that kingship retained a central place in the political imagination of the Frankish world. The Carolingians themselves understood this deeply, which is why they governed for generations as mayors of the palace before daring to assume the royal title, and why Pepin the Short sought papal approval and ritual sanction before deposing Childeric III, transforming a political coup into a sacred and moral act. This moment marked a profound shift in the theory of kingship, as legitimacy was no longer grounded primarily in bloodline and inherited sanctity but increasingly in moral fitness, divine favor mediated through the Church, and the capacity to protect and govern the Christian people. Yet even as this new model emerged, it was built upon Merovingian foundations, for the alliance between Frankish rulers and the papacy, the use of anointing and religious ritual to sanctify kingship, and the conception of the king as defender of the Church all had precedence in Merovingian practice. The memory of the Merovingians also persisted at the local level, where royal burials, saints' cults, and legendary traditions continued to shape regional identities, as Merovingian queens, princes, and bishops were venerated as saints, their tombs becoming centers of pilgrimage and devotion that preserved dynastic memory in sacred form. Figures such as Queen Radegund, who renounced royal life to found a monastery and became a model of Christian holiness, illustrate how Merovingian identity could be transformed from political authority into spiritual prestige, allowing the dynasty to endure in cultural memory even as its political power vanished. Archaeology has played a crucial role in reshaping modern understanding of the Merovingian world, revealing a material culture far richer and more sophisticated than earlier historians assumed, as lavish grave goods, carefully planned settlements, and evidence of long-distance trade challenge outdated notions of a crude or collapsing society. Excavations of cemeteries show complex burial rituals that communicated status, identity, and belief, while analysis of weapons, jewelry, and coins demonstrates technological skill and artistic creativity, situating the Merovingians firmly within the broader patterns of early medieval Europe rather than at its margins. These discoveries have reinforced the view of the Merovingian period as one of adaptation rather than decline, in which communities responded creatively to the loss of Roman imperial structures by developing new forms of social organization, economic exchange, and political authority. The historiography of the Merovingians itself reflects changing attitudes toward the early Middle Ages, as Enlightenment and 19th-century scholars often viewed the period through the lens of progress and decline, contrasting Roman order with barbarian chaos, while 20th and 21st century historians have emphasized continuity, hybridity, and resilience, recognizing the Merovingians as agents of transformation rather than mere destroyers of classical civilization. This shift has profound implications for how the dynasty is understood, moving the narrative away from moral judgment and toward structural analysis, and highlighting the ways in which Merovingian solutions to governance, law, and identity laid the groundwork for medieval Europe's defining institutions. The Merovingian experience also offers valuable insight into the nature of power itself, illustrating how authority can be both deeply rooted in tradition and highly contingent on circumstance, and how symbols, rituals, and beliefs can sustain political systems long after their practical effectiveness has diminished. The sacred hair of Merovingian kings, once a potent emblem of divine right, ultimately became a hollow symbol when detached from the ability to command resources and loyalty, yet its continued preservation until the dynasty's end underscores the enduring human need for legitimacy grounded in history and myth. The gradual replacement of this model by Carolingian kingship did not erase these needs but redirected them, channeling sacred authority through ecclesiastical endorsement and moral reform, a process that would culminate in the medieval conception of Christian kingship and empire. Beyond the realm of politics, the Merovingians shaped the social and cultural landscape of Europe in enduring ways, as the spread of Christianity under their rule redefined time, space, and community, organizing life around the liturgical calendar, sacred geography, and moral norms that continue to influence European culture. The parish system, monastic networks, and episcopal structures that expanded during the Merovingian era created a framework for social cohesion and cultural transmission that survived dynastic change and provided continuity across centuries of upheaval. Linguistically, the gradual evolution of spoken Latin into early Romance languages occurred within the Merovingian world, shaped by patterns of settlement, administration, and ecclesiastical communication established during this period, while Germanic influences contributed vocabulary, names, and legal concepts that enriched emerging European languages. Even the concept of Europe itself, as a culturally and religiously distinct space, owes something to the Merovingian synthesis of Roman Christianity and Germanic kingship, a synthesis that helped define the boundaries between Latin Christendom and its neighbors. In reflecting on the Merovingian dynasty as a whole, it becomes clear that its importance lies not in any single achievement or failure, but in its role as a bridge between worlds, connecting the ancient and the medieval, the Roman and the Germanic, the pagan past and the Christian future. The dynasty's rulers grappled with unprecedented challenges, governing territories larger and more diverse than any previous Frankish polity, negotiating relationships with powerful religious institutions, managing succession in the absence of stable bureaucratic structures, and responding to external pressures from rival kingdoms and emerging powers. Their solutions were imperfect and often violent, but they were also innovative, laying down patterns of rule, law, and culture that endured long after the dynasty itself faded from view. The Merovingians remind us that history is not a linear progression toward greater efficiency or enlightenment, but a complex process shaped by contingency, adaptation, and human agency, in which success and failure are often inseparable. By examining their rise, dominance, decline, and memory across four interconnected parts, the Merovingian dynasty emerges not as a footnote to later empires but as a foundational chapter in the making of Europe, a dynasty whose legacy is embedded in the political ideals, cultural practices, and historical consciousness of the continent itself, and whose story continues to challenge simplistic narratives of decline by revealing the creativity and resilience that defined an age of profound transformation. The fifth and final extension of the Merovingian dynasty series turns toward a wider horizon, situating the Merovingians within the comparative framework of early medieval civilizations and examining how their political experiments, cultural syntheses, and symbolic practices resonate far beyond their own time. For the true measure of a dynasty is not only what it ruled, but how its choices shaped the possibilities available to those who followed. When viewed alongside contemporary kingdoms such as the Visigoths in Iberia, the Ostrogoths and Lombards in Italy, and the Anglo-Saxon realms in Britain, the Merovingian experience appears neither uniquely chaotic nor exceptionally backward but representative of a broader post-Roman struggle to reconcile inherited imperial traditions with new forms of authority rooted in kinship warfare and Christian belief. Like their counterparts elsewhere, Merovingian rulers inherited Roman cities, roads, laws, and Christian institutions without the fiscal machinery or professional bureaucracy that had sustained them, forcing kings to improvise systems of governance that relied on land, loyalty, and ritual rather than taxation and centralized administration. What distinguished the Merovingians was the durability of their royal house and the geographic scale of their kingdom, which allowed their solutions to exert a disproportionate influence on the development of Western Europe. The Frankish model of kingship, combining sacral legitimacy, military leadership, and alliance with the Catholic Church, proved more adaptable than the Arian Christian monarchies of the Goths, whose religious divergence from the Roman population undermined their authority and ultimately facilitated their replacement. In this sense, Clovis's conversion was not merely a local event, but part of a broader realignment that positioned the Frankish kingdom as the core of Latin Christendom in the West. The Merovingian approach to succession, though often criticized for its divisive consequences, also reflected deeply rooted cultural assumptions about fairness, kinship, and property, assumptions shared across Germanic societies, and while partible inheritance weakened centralized authority, it simultaneously ensured that royal power remained embedded within the broader family network, preventing the emergence of an isolated and potentially illegitimate autocracy. This tension between unity and division would continue to shape European politics for centuries, resurfacing in feudal inheritance practices and dynastic conflicts well into the High Middle Ages. The Merovingians' interaction with the natural landscape further illustrates their historical significance, as they governed a world in which forests, rivers, and agricultural land were central to power and identity, and their expansion transformed patterns of settlement, land use, and environmental management across Gaul. Royal and aristocratic estates reorganized rural production, monasteries cleared forests and introduced new agricultural techniques, and river networks facilitated trade and communication, integrating regions into a shared economic sphere that outlived the dynasty itself. These developments contributed to the gradual stabilization of the European countryside, creating the material foundations upon which later medieval societies would be built. In the realm of law and social order, the Merovingian emphasis on written law codes, oaths, and compensation represents a crucial stage in the evolution of European legal culture, bridging the gap between Roman jurisprudence and medieval customary law. While justice remained personal and unequal, shaped by status and power, the very act of codification reflected an aspiration toward order and predictability, an aspiration that would be expanded under the Carolingians and later institutionalized in medieval legal systems. The Merovingians also played a decisive role in shaping historical consciousness itself, as their reign coincided with the emergence of Christian historiography in the West, a mode of writing that interpreted political events through the lens of divine providence, moral judgment, and sacred history. Chroniclers such as Gregory of Tours did more than record events. They constructed narratives that explained why kingdoms rose and fell, why rulers prospered or failed, and how God's will was manifested in human affairs, establishing interpretive frameworks that would dominate medieval historical thought. Through these narratives, the Merovingians became moral exemplars and cautionary figures, their actions scrutinized not only for political effectiveness but for spiritual meaning, a legacy that ensured their continued relevance in medieval education and preaching. The symbolic language of Merovingian power, particularly the emphasis on bodily markers such as hair, lineage, and ritual gesture, also left a lasting imprint on European political culture, highlighting the importance of visible signs in communicating authority to largely illiterate populations. Even as later rulers adopted more institutional forms of governance, they continued to rely on ceremony, regalia, and sacred symbolism to legitimize their rule, a practice that can be traced back through Carolingian coronations to Merovingian conceptions of sacred kingship. The transformation of these symbols over time, from hair to anointing oil, from lineage alone to divinely sanctioned office, reflects the adaptability of political symbolism and its capacity to evolve while preserving continuity. The Merovingian dynasty also occupies a significant place in the modern imagination, where it has been alternately romanticized as an age of warrior kings and queens or dismissed as a period of darkness preceding the Carolingian Renaissance, interpretations that reveal as much about modern values as about early medieval realities. Literature, art, and popular history have often emphasized the drama of Merovingian court life, with its intrigues, feuds, and formidable queens, finding in it a mirror for enduring human themes of ambition, loyalty, and power. At the same time, the reassessment of the Merovingians by modern historians reflects a broader re-evaluation of the early Middle Ages as a formative rather than regressive era, encouraging a more nuanced appreciation of how societies adapt to systemic collapse and reinvent themselves under new conditions. In this light, the Merovingians emerge as case studies in resilience, demonstrating how political communities can survive the loss of imperial structures by mobilizing cultural memory, religious belief, and social networks to create new forms of order. Their failures, particularly the inability to sustain centralized authority across generations, are inseparable from their successes, for the same decentralization that weakened kingship also empowered local institutions and elites to govern effectively in the absence of strong central control, contributing to the long-term stability of the regions they ruled. The end of the Merovingian dynasty thus appears not as a catastrophic rupture, but as a recalibration of power within an already evolving system, a process that highlights the continuity of European development across dynastic boundaries. By the time the Carolingians assumed the royal title, much of what defined medieval European society was already in place, shaped by centuries of Merovingian rule, and the new dynasty's achievements were made possible by foundations laid by their predecessors. In bringing this extended series to a close, the Merovingian dynasty can be understood as a living experiment in governance at the crossroads of history, an experiment conducted under conditions of uncertainty, scarcity, and cultural diversity, yet marked by remarkable creativity and endurance. Their world was one in which the past was never fully abandoned, the future never fully known, and power was constantly renegotiated between kings, nobles, churchmen, and communities, a world that mirrors in many ways the transitional moments faced by societies throughout history. The Merovingians did not merely rule during a time of change, they helped define what change itself would look like, shaping the contours of medieval Europe through their actions, institutions, and ideas. Seen in this broader and more reflective perspective, the Merovingian dynasty stands not at the margins of European history but at its core, a dynasty whose long and complex legacy continues to inform our understanding of how civilization survive collapse, transform tradition, and create continuity amid disruption, ensuring that their story remains essential to any serious exploration of Europe's origins. The sixth and reflective continuation of the Merovingian dynasty series turns inward to examine the human experience of Merovingian rule, the rhythms of everyday life, belief, fear, loyalty, and survival that defined the lives of those who lived beneath the long-haired kings. For dynasties are not sustained by rulers alone but by the millions whose labor, faith, and obedience give meaning to power. For the majority of the population of Merovingian Gaul, life unfolded in small rural communities shaped by agriculture, seasonal cycles, and local customs, where Roman traditions lingered in field boundaries, road networks, and villa estates even as new Frankish elites imposed themselves as landowners and protectors. Peasants lived close to subsistence, cultivating grain, vineyards, and livestock, bound to the land through obligations of rent, labor, and service, yet they were not entirely powerless, for village communities retained customary rights and collective identities that mediated their relationship with lords, monasteries, and royal officials. The presence of Merovingian authority was often distant and episodic, felt most strongly through tax-like dues, military levies, judicial assemblies, and the demands of warfare, which could bring devastation in the form of raids, requisitions, and forced labor, but also offered opportunities for protection and patronage when kings or nobles chose to intervene. In towns and former Roman cities, life was more complex, as merchants, craftsmen, clergy, and administrators interacted within shrinking but still vital urban centers that served as hubs of trade, worship, and governance, preserving elements of Roman civic life even as their functions adapted to new political realities. Markets connected countryside and city, exchanging agricultural surplus for tools, salt, pottery, and luxury items, and while coinage circulated unevenly, barter and local exchange networks ensured economic continuity. Religion permeated every aspect of Merovingian existence, shaping how people understood illness, misfortune, justice, and hope, as Christianity provided both an explanation for suffering and a promise of order in a world marked by violence and uncertainty. Churches and monasteries became focal points of communal life, offering spiritual protection, charity, and a sense of belonging, while saints were believed to intervene directly in human affairs, healing the sick, punishing the unjust, and safeguarding communities from danger. The cult of relics transformed landscapes, as shrines attracted pilgrims and royal patronage, reinforcing ties between local devotion and dynastic legitimacy, and miracles recorded in saints' lives reveal a worldview in which the divine and the earthly were inseparable. Yet older beliefs did not vanish overnight, as popular practices blended Christian ritual with pre-Christian customs, creating a lived religion that was deeply practical and emotionally resonant, a synthesis tolerated and sometimes encouraged by the clergy as a means of gradual conversion. Warfare, an ever-present reality in Merovingian politics, left a deep imprint on society, as campaigns disrupted agriculture, displaced populations, and normalized violence as a means of resolving disputes, while at the same time providing pathways to status and wealth for warriors and their families. Military service bound free men to kings and nobles through oaths of loyalty and shared risk, reinforcing the personal nature of power, and the distribution of spoils and land after victories reshaped social hierarchies, creating new elites while erasing others. The psychological toll of this environment is difficult to measure, but the prevalence of protective rituals, prayers for peace, and ecclesiastical efforts to limit violence suggests a society acutely aware of its fragility. Justice under the Merovingians was experienced not as an abstract system but as a negotiated process rooted in local assemblies, oaths, and mediation, where outcomes depended on reputation, kinship, and access to powerful patrons. And while this often favored the strong, it also provided mechanisms for resolving conflict without endless bloodshed. The king's role as judge, even when largely symbolic, carried profound meaning, embodying the hope that divine justice might be realized through human authority, a hope that persisted even as real power shifted elsewhere. Family life formed the core of social stability, with kinship networks providing protection, economic support, and identity, and marriage serving as both a personal bond and a political instrument, linking families across regions and status groups. Women's experiences varied widely, shaped by class and circumstance, as peasant women labored alongside men in fields and households, while aristocratic women navigated a world of marriage alliances, religious patronage, and occasional political intervention, their influence often exercised indirectly but sometimes decisively. The prominence of queens, regents, and abbesses reflects not an anomaly but the flexibility of Merovingian social structures, which allowed women to wield authority within defined but significant spaces. Childhood was precarious, marked by high mortality and early responsibility, yet royal and noble children were invested with immense symbolic importance, their survival or death capable of reshaping political landscapes, while monastic education offered an alternative path for some, shaping future clerics and administrators. Death itself was a constant companion, shaping attitudes toward time and memory, as burial practices, commemorative rituals, and prayers for the dead reinforced bonds between the living and the departed, and royal tombs became sites where dynastic identity was anchored in sacred space. The emotional world of the Merovingian era, though distant, can be glimpsed through chronicles, letters, and hagiography, revealing fear, ambition, devotion, grief, and hope expressed within a framework that interpreted human experience as part of a divine narrative. These sources show individuals striving for meaning and security in a world where political order was fragile and the future uncertain, relying on faith, family, and local community to navigate instability. When the Merovingian dynasty finally receded into history, it left behind not only institutions and territories but a lived culture that continued to shape behavior, belief, and identity long after the last long-haired king was tonsured and confined to a monastery. The Carolingians inherited a population already accustomed to Christian kingship, local autonomy, and negotiated authority, conditions forged under Merovingian rule, and their reforms built upon rather than erase these realities. In this deeply human perspective, the Merovingian dynasty appears not merely as a sequence of rulers but as an age in which ordinary people adapted creatively to profound change, sustaining communities, beliefs, and traditions amid uncertainty. Their lives give substance to the abstract processes of transformation traced in earlier parts of this series, reminding us that history is ultimately lived from the ground up, through daily choices and shared meanings. By concluding the series with this focus on lived experience, the Merovingian world emerges as a society neither lost nor primitive but resilient, complex, and profoundly influential, a world in which the foundations of medieval European life were quietly but enduringly laid. The seventh continuation of the Merovingian Dynasty series turns toward the long afterlife of Merovingian influence across medieval Europe, tracing how ideas first articulated under the long-haired kings continued to shape political imagination, territorial identity, and cultural memory long after the dynasty itself had faded from the stage of power. For dynasties rarely end at the moment of deposition, but instead dissolve slowly into the structures, myths, and habits of the societies they once ruled. In the centuries following the Carolingian takeover, Merovingian precedents lingered in the very language of kingship, as medieval rulers across Francia and beyond continued to describe their authority in personal, sacral terms rather than purely institutional ones, reflecting a Merovingian inheritance in which power flowed from the ruler's body, lineage, and divine favor. Even as feudal relationships grew more formalized, the expectation that a king should lead in war, dispense justice personally, and protect the church remained deeply rooted in Merovingian tradition, shaping how later monarchs were judged by nobles, clergy, and common people alike. Territorial identities that emerged under Merovingian rule proved remarkably resilient, as regions such as Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy continued to influence political geography and cultural distinction long after their original administrative boundaries disappeared, re-emerging in later duchies, counties, and spheres of influence that structured medieval politics. These regional identities were reinforced by local saints, monasteries, and aristocratic families whose origins traced back to Merovingian patronage, creating a layered sense of belonging that linked community, faith, and memory to a distant dynastic past. The Merovingian contribution to the shaping of European Christianity also endured in subtle but powerful ways, particularly in the close intertwining of royal authority and sacred space, as kings continue to be buried in monasteries, sponsor relic cults, and seek spiritual legitimacy through association with holy figures, practices that owed much to Merovingian precedents. The Abbey of St. Denis, founded under Dagobert I as a royal necropolis, became a cornerstone of French royal identity for nearly a millennium, a living testament to Merovingian innovation in the sacralization of monarchy and memory. Legal traditions likewise carried Merovingian DNA forward into later medieval systems, as customary law, local assemblies, and the emphasis on negotiated justice persisted alongside the gradual revival of Roman legal concepts, producing hybrid systems that balanced written codes with communal practice. The idea that law was both inherited and adaptable, grounded in tradition yet open to revision, reflected Merovingian legal culture and helped medieval societies manage continuity amid change. In literature and legend, the Merovingians assumed an almost mythic quality, appearing in chansons de geste, chronicles, and later romances as shadowy ancestors of heroic lineages, their violent courts and dramatic feuds providing fertile ground for storytelling that blurred history and imagination. Queens like Brunhilde and Fredegund were remembered as archetypes of female power, ambition, and danger, their stories retold and reshaped to reflect evolving attitudes toward women and authority, while kings like Clovis were elevated into semi-legendary founders whose conversion and conquests symbolized the birth of Christian Europe. These narratives were not static but continually reinterpreted, serving the needs of different eras by offering moral lessons, political warnings, or sources of collective pride. The Merovingian past also informed medieval concepts of legitimacy and rebellion, as disputes over rightful rule often invoked ancient lineage, precedent, and custom, echoing Merovingian assumptions that authority derived from continuity with ancestral tradition rather than abstract legality alone. Even challenges to royal power were framed within this inherited logic, as rebels sought to present themselves not as destroyers of order but as restorers of rightful practice, a pattern visible throughout medieval political culture. Beyond Francia, the Merovingian model influenced neighboring regions through diplomacy, marriage, and missionary activity, as Frankish rulers and clerics carried their ideas of kingship, law, and Christian practice into Germany, the Low Countries, and beyond, contributing to the formation of a shared Western European cultural zone. Missionaries trained in Merovingian monasteries played key roles in converting and organizing new Christian communities, bringing with them assumptions about the relationship between church, ruler, and people that would shape emerging polities. The endurance of Merovingian influence also reveals the power of institutional memory, as monasteries, bishoprics, and noble families preserved charters, saints' lives, and oral traditions that anchored local identity in a Merovingian past, ensuring that the dynasty remained present even when political narratives sought to marginalize it. This persistence complicates simplistic notions of dynastic replacement, showing instead how new regimes often depended on the legitimacy conferred by older ones, selectively remembering, reinterpreting, or even appropriating their symbols to strengthen their own authority. In modern times, the Merovingians have continued to capture imagination, not only among historians but in popular culture, where they have been recast as mysterious custodians of secret knowledge, ancestral founders of nations, or symbols of a lost age of primal kingship, interpretations that, while often speculative or fanciful, testify to the dynasty's enduring symbolic power. Scholarly engagement with the Merovingians has likewise evolved, moving away from narratives of decline toward more nuanced analyses that emphasize adaptation, hybridity, and regional diversity, recognizing the dynasty as central to understanding how Europe transitioned from antiquity to the Middle Ages. This historiographical shift mirrors broader changes in how societies understand periods of transformation, valuing resilience and creativity over linear progress and acknowledging that stability can emerge from decentralization as well as from strong central authority. The Merovingian dynasty thus offers a lens through which to explore enduring questions about governance, identity, and memory, illustrating how political systems are sustained not only by force but by belief, ritual, and shared understanding, and how these elements can outlast the structures that first gave them form. Their story demonstrates that the foundations of Europe were laid not in moments of sudden clarity, but through generations of negotiation between old and new, sacred and practical, unity and diversity. By following the Merovingians across 7 interconnected parts, the dynasty emerges as a living continuum rather than a closed chapter, its influence radiating outward across centuries, shaping how power was imagined, exercised, and remembered. In this final extension, the Merovingians stand revealed not merely as rulers of an early medieval kingdom, but as architects of enduring patterns that continue to inform Europe's political and cultural landscape, reminding us that the deepest legacies of history are often those that become so embedded in everyday assumptions that they are no longer recognized as inheritances at all. And in that quiet persistence lies the true measure of the Merovingian dynasty's place in the long story of civilization. The 8th and expansive continuation of the Merovingian dynasty series turns to a reflective synthesis that connects power, belief, landscape, and historical consciousness into a single unfolding narrative, seeking to understand how a dynasty rooted in the turbulence of post-Roman collapse helped shape the deep structures of European civilization in ways that are often invisible precisely because they became normal. By the time the Merovingians emerged as rulers of the Franks, the ancient certainties of empire had dissolved, leaving behind fragments of Roman order embedded in roads, cities, law, and Christian institutions, and it was within this fractured inheritance that Merovingian kingship evolved as a practical response to instability rather than a coherent ideological project. The Merovingians ruled a world defined by movement and negotiation, where boundaries were fluid, identities layered, and authority continuously tested, and this environment forced rulers, nobles, clergy, and common people alike to redefine what it meant to belong to a political community. Kingship under the Merovingians was never absolute, yet it was rarely irrelevant, functioning instead as a symbolic anchor around which competing interests could organize themselves, allowing society to avoid total fragmentation even during periods of intense conflict. The king's presence, whether strong or weak, provided a focal point for law, ritual, and memory, and this symbolic function proved just as important as military success or administrative capacity in sustaining the Frankish world across generations. One of the most profound Merovingian contributions to European history lies in their handling of plurality, as they governed populations that differed in language, custom, legal tradition, and social structure, choosing accommodation over enforced uniformity, and in doing so establishing a model of rule that valued continuity alongside change. Roman law existed beside Germanic custom, Christian morality coexisted with older traditions, and regional identities persisted within a broader political framework, creating a layered society capable of absorbing difference without collapsing into chaos. This pluralism was not driven by ideological tolerance but by pragmatic necessity, yet its long-term effects were significant, shaping a European tradition in which diversity became a managed condition rather than an existential threat. The Merovingian relationship with land further reveals their historical importance, as control over territory was expressed less through rigid borders than through networks of estates, monasteries, roads, and river routes, emphasizing connectivity over containment. Power radiated outward from royal and aristocratic centers through personal ties and economic dependency, embedding authority in the physical landscape and making governance an experiential reality rather than an abstract concept. This spatial logic influenced later medieval political organization, where lordship, jurisdiction, and allegiance were defined by overlapping claims rooted in land and community rather than centralized sovereignty. Memory played a decisive role in sustaining Merovingian legitimacy, as dynastic narratives, saints' cults, burial sites, and oral traditions bound the present to the past, transforming history into a living resource for political and social stability. The careful cultivation of memory, whether through royal necropolises like Saint Denis or through the veneration of Merovingian saints, ensured that authority was experienced as ancient and continuous, a quality that later rulers would actively seek to inherit or replicate. Even when Merovingian kings lost real power, their memory retained political potency, forcing successors to negotiate with the past rather than erase it. The Merovingian approach to violence and order further illuminates the transitional nature of their world, as warfare remained endemic yet was increasingly constrained by moral, legal, and ritual frameworks that sought to channel conflict rather than eliminate it. Oaths, compensation, ecclesiastical mediation, and legal assemblies did not end violence, but they created predictable patterns through which disputes could be managed, reflecting a society striving for stability without the tools of centralized enforcement. These mechanisms laid the groundwork for later medieval systems of justice and lordship, where negotiated power became a defining feature of political life. Religion, perhaps more than any other force, unified the Merovingian world, not by erasing difference but by providing a shared language of meaning that connected local experience to universal narratives of salvation and divine order. Christianity under the Merovingians was lived, tactile, and communal, expressed through pilgrimage, relics, festivals, and moral storytelling, making faith a social practice rather than a distant doctrine. By aligning kingship with this religious universe, the Merovingians ensured that political authority was embedded in everyday life, shaping how people understood loyalty, obligation, and hope. The Carolingians would later refine and formalize this relationship, but its emotional and cultural foundations were unmistakably Merovingian. From a long-term perspective, the decline of the Merovingian dynasty appears not as failure but as transition, a moment when the mechanisms that once sustained power no longer aligned with evolving social realities, requiring adaptation rather than preservation. The shift from sacred bloodline to morally sanctioned kingship, from personal charisma to institutional reform, reflects broader changes in how authority was imagined and justified, changes that occurred gradually and unevenly across Europe. Yet even as new models emerged, they carried Merovingian traces within them, demonstrating the dynasty's enduring influence on the grammar of power. The Merovingians also challenge modern assumptions about progress and decline, reminding us that periods of fragmentation can be creatively productive, generating solutions tailored to complexity rather than uniformity. Their world was one of limits, constrained by technology, communication, and resources. Yet within these limits they forged durable structures of community and belief that outlasted their political supremacy. In this sense, the Merovingians exemplify a historical truth often overlooked, that resilience, not efficiency, is the key to long-term survival in times of transformation. As this extended series reaches its 8th part, the Merovingian dynasty stands revealed as a foundational experiment in post-imperial governance, one whose significance lies in its capacity to hold together a diverse and volatile world long enough for new forms of order to emerge. Their legacy is woven into the fabric of European identity, visible in concepts of kingship, law, religion, and memory that continue to shape historical consciousness. The Merovingians did not simply bridge antiquity and the Middle Ages. They defined the terms of that passage, demonstrating how societies can adapt inherited traditions to new realities without severing their connection to the past. In doing so, they left behind not a single monument or institution but a pattern of transformation itself, a way of surviving change by absorbing it, and it is in this quiet yet profound achievement that the true historical weight of the Merovingian dynasty ultimately resides. The 9th continuation of the Merovingian dynasty series turns toward a final deep-layered reflection on identity, legitimacy, and historical continuity, examining how the Merovingian experience reshaped the very idea of what it meant to rule, to belong, and to remember in a Europe emerging from imperial collapse. For by the time later generations looked back on the long-haired kings, the world they had governed had already been transformed by the patterns they set in motion. Merovingian rule unfolded in an age when political identity was no longer anchored in citizenship of an empire, but in allegiance to persons, families, and sacred traditions, and it was within this framework that the Franks forged a durable sense of collective belonging that transcended tribal origins without erasing them. The Merovingian kings did not attempt to homogenize their populations. Instead, they allowed multiple identities to coexist under a shared royal and Christian umbrella, enabling Romans, Franks, Burgundians, and others to imagine themselves as part of a single political world while retaining local customs, laws, and memories. This flexible conception of identity proved crucial to long-term stability, for it avoided the resistance that often accompanies forced uniformity and allowed loyalty to grow organically through protection, patronage, and ritual. The Frankish name itself, once an ethnic marker, gradually became a political identity under the Merovingians, a process that illustrates how dynastic rule can transform social categories into enduring collective concepts. Legitimacy within this system was not abstract but experiential, grounded in visible continuity with the past, successful mediation between competing interests, and the perceived favor of God, and Merovingian rulers invested heavily in all 3 dimensions. Genealogy linked kings to heroic ancestors, ritual affirmed their sacred status, and public acts of justice and generosity reinforced their role as guardians of order, even when their actual capacity to enforce decisions was limited. This model of legitimacy, deeply personal and symbolic, would shape European political culture for centuries, ensuring that authority was measured as much by moral and ritual expectations as by administrative effectiveness. The gradual erosion of Merovingian power reveals the limits of this system rather than its irrelevance, as changing economic and military conditions demanded new forms of leadership that could mobilize resources more efficiently, a challenge ultimately met by the Carolingians, who inherited Merovingian legitimacy while reshaping its foundations. Yet even this transition underscores the dynasty's enduring influence, for the Carolingians did not reject Merovingian identity outright but absorbed it, presenting themselves as rightful heirs rather than revolutionary outsiders, and in doing so confirmed the power of Merovingian memory. Across medieval Europe, rulers would continue to ground innovation in appeals to tradition, a habit formed in the Merovingian age when survival depended on balancing change with continuity. The social hierarchies that crystallized under Merovingian rule likewise left a lasting imprint, as relationships between kings, nobles, clergy, and common people were defined less by rigid institutional roles than by negotiated obligations, reciprocal expectations, and personal bonds. This relational structure fostered both instability and resilience, enabling society to function even when central authority weakened, and it would later evolve into the feudal systems of the Middle Ages, which preserved the logic of personal allegiance while formalizing its terms. The Merovingian world thus represents a critical stage in the evolution of European social organization, one in which flexibility and adaptation were essential to survival. Cultural transmission under the Merovingians further illustrates their historical depth, as monasteries, churches, and aristocratic households became conduits through which knowledge, values, and memory flowed across generations. Education was limited but purposeful, focused on preserving sacred texts, legal traditions, and historical narratives that reinforced collective identity, and this selective transmission ensured continuity without freezing society in the past. Artistic and material culture played a similar role, encoding symbols of authority, faith, and belonging into objects that could be seen, touched, and inherited, embedding meaning in everyday life. The Merovingian synthesis of Roman craftsmanship, Germanic symbolism, and Christian iconography created a visual language that communicated power and belief across linguistic and cultural divides, a language that continued to resonate long after the dynasty's fall. The Merovingians also shaped how Europeans understood time and history, as Christian chronology and sacred narrative reframed the past as a purposeful journey guided by divine will, transforming political events into moral lessons and dynastic fortunes into signs of cosmic order. This worldview encouraged communities to interpret crisis as correction rather than collapse, fostering resilience in the face of uncertainty and reinforcing the belief that stability could be restored through reform and piety. Such assumptions would underpin medieval reform movements, royal ideologies, and popular devotion, linking Merovingian spiritual culture to later developments across Europe. From the perspective of historical memory, the Merovingians occupy a paradoxical position, simultaneously foundational and obscure, remembered through fragments, legends, and reinterpretations rather than continuous narrative, and it is precisely this ambiguity that has allowed them to remain symbolically potent. Their story has been retold to serve multiple purposes, as a warning against dynastic decay, a celebration of Christian beginnings, or a mythic origin for national identity, demonstrating how early medieval history functions as a reservoir of meaning rather than a fixed account. Modern historical inquiry, by recovering the complexity of Merovingian society, has revealed the dynasty not as a failed experiment but as a formative phase whose achievements were embedded so deeply in European structures that they became invisible. In assessing the Merovingian dynasty at this advanced stage of reflection, it becomes clear that their greatest legacy lies in normalization, in making new forms of life, belief, and governance feel natural after the collapse of empire. They normalized Christian kingship, normalized decentralized authority, normalized cultural hybridity, and normalized the idea that continuity could be preserved without uniformity, achievements that allowed Europe to move forward without severing its ties to the past. The Merovingians thus stand as quiet architects of transition, rulers whose influence endured not through monuments or manifestos, but through habits of thought and practice that shaped everyday life. As this ninth part concludes, the Merovingian dynasty emerges as a living process rather than a closed chapter, a reminder that history advances not only through dramatic rupture, but through long periods of adjustment in which societies learn how to survive change. Their world, marked by uncertainty yet sustained by belief and community, offers enduring insight into how political and cultural order can be rebuilt after collapse. And it is in this lesson, as much as in any event or ruler, that the Merovingians continue to speak to the present, affirming their place at the very heart of Europe's long historical journey. The 10th and culminating continuation of the Merovingian Dynasty series brings the long narrative to a philosophical and civilizational conclusion, examining how the Merovingian experience illuminates enduring patterns of human governance, cultural survival, and historical transformation. For at its deepest level, the story of the Merovingians is not merely about one dynasty, but about how societies reconstruct meaning and authority after the collapse of a world. When Rome fell in the West, it did not leave behind a blank slate but a fragmented inheritance of institutions, memories, expectations, and fears, and the Merovingians ruled in the shadow of this inheritance, neither restoring the empire nor abandoning it, but reshaping its remnants into something workable for a new age. Their kingdom was not designed according to abstract theory. It evolved through improvisation, compromise, and repetition, revealing a fundamental truth of history that order is often the product of adaptation rather than intention. Merovingian kingship succeeded not because it was efficient but because it was recognizable, drawing on familiar symbols of authority while remaining flexible enough to absorb change. And this balance allowed Frankish society to stabilize at a moment when total disintegration was a real possibility. The long-haired kings embodied continuity in a world of rupture, and even when their power weakened, the idea they represented continued to organize political life. This reveals a central lesson of the Merovingian age, that legitimacy is as much a cultural achievement as a political one, sustained by shared belief, ritual, and memory rather than coercion alone. The Merovingians understood, instinctively if not theoretically, that people obey not only because they are forced to but because authority makes sense within their worldview, and by embedding kingship within Christian cosmology, ancestral tradition, and local practice, they ensured that rule remained intelligible even amid conflict. The slow decline of Merovingian authority further demonstrates that political systems rarely collapse suddenly. Instead, they are hollowed out as their mechanisms lose alignment with social realities, and what follows is not chaos but reconfiguration, as new actors step into existing symbolic frameworks to redefine power. The Carolingians did not destroy Merovingian kingship, they completed its transformation, shifting emphasis from sacred bloodline to moral and institutional legitimacy, while retaining the deep structures of Christian rule and personal allegiance first normalized under Merovingian governance. This continuity underscores how deeply the Merovingians shaped the political grammar of medieval Europe, providing a shared language of authority that outlived their dynasty by centuries. Beyond politics, the Merovingian period offers profound insight into cultural endurance, as language, law, faith, and social custom evolved not through abrupt replacement but through gradual fusion, producing a hybrid civilization capable of preserving the past while moving beyond it. The emergence of Romance languages from spoken Latin, the persistence of Roman legal concepts within Germanic custom, and the blending of pagan and Christian practices into lived religion all occurred within the Merovingian world, demonstrating that cultural survival often depends on adaptability rather than purity. These processes were not guided by centralized planning but by everyday human choices, made in villages, monasteries, courts, and marketplaces, reinforcing the idea that history is shaped as much from below as from above. The Merovingians ruled over a society that learned to live with uncertainty, where war, disease, and political instability were constants, yet where community, faith, and custom provided enough coherence to sustain life across generations. In this sense, the Merovingian age stands as a testament to resilience, showing how societies can endure prolonged instability without collapsing into anarchy. Their world challenges modern assumptions that strong institutions are the sole guarantors of order, revealing instead how informal networks, shared beliefs, and symbolic authority can compensate for institutional weakness. The Merovingian legacy also forces a reconsideration of progress, as their era defies simple categorization as either decline or advancement, instead representing a reorientation of civilization toward new priorities, values, and forms of organization better suited to post-imperial realities. This reorientation laid the foundations of medieval Europe, shaping concepts of kingship, law, and Christian identity that would define the continent for a millennium. Memory itself emerges as one of the Merovingians' most enduring contributions, as their careful cultivation of dynastic, sacred, and communal remembrance created a framework through which societies could locate themselves in time, linking past, present, and future in a meaningful narrative. Royal necropolises, saints' cults, genealogies, and chronicles transformed history into a moral resource, guiding behavior and legitimizing authority, and this memory culture would become a defining feature of medieval European civilization. Even modern historical inquiry, in seeking to recover the Merovingians from caricature and neglect, participates in this long process of reinterpretation, demonstrating how the past remains active and contested. The Merovingian dynasty thus stands at the center of a larger human story about adaptation after collapse, illustrating how political communities survive the loss of imperial order by redefining legitimacy, embracing hybridity, and grounding authority in shared meaning rather than abstract systems. Their experience resonates far beyond early medieval Europe, offering insight into how societies today confront transformation, uncertainty, and the tension between tradition and change. The Merovingians did not provide solutions in the modern sense, but they modeled a way of living through transition, one that prioritized continuity without rigidity and authority without absolute control. As this 10th part concludes the extended series, the Merovingian dynasty can be fully understood not as a prelude to greater empires nor as a failed experiment, but as a foundational civilization in its own right, one that taught Europe how to survive the end of one world and the slow emergence of another. Their true achievement lies in having made a future possible when the past had collapsed, and it is in this quiet, enduring accomplishment that the Merovingians claim their lasting place in the deep history of human civilization.
The 11th continuation of the Merovingian Dynasty series delves into the intricate web of power, culture, and historical memory that surrounded the dynasty, exploring how the Merovingians not only ruled but also shaped the perception of rule itself, for their long-haired kings exercised authority in ways that were simultaneously tangible and symbolic, practical and performative, creating a template for European governance that extended far beyond the immediate political sphere. At the heart of Merovingian kingship was the fusion of sacred and secular power, an inseparable combination in which the ruler's body, lineage, and ritual presence conveyed legitimacy as powerfully as law or military might. The king's hair, long and uncut, became a visual emblem of divine favor and dynastic continuity, signifying not merely personal status but the moral and spiritual authority that anchored society, while ceremonial practices such as oaths, blessings, and public adjudication reinforced the perception that the king embodied both justice and protection. This duality of presence allowed the Merovingians to govern a realm without the bureaucratic infrastructure of the late Roman Empire, relying instead on networks of personal loyalty, kinship obligations, and aristocratic patronage, yet it also created vulnerabilities, as power was tied to personality and perception, and periods of weak or minor kings often exposed the fragility of the system. The dynasty's approach to succession, based on partible inheritance, further complicated governance by dividing the kingdom among multiple heirs, generating rivalry and fragmentation, yet this very system also embedded rulers in a web of familial obligation that prevented outright collapse, demonstrating the nuanced balance between division and continuity in Merovingian political culture. Beyond governance, the Merovingians were instrumental in shaping the material and spiritual landscape of early medieval Europe. Monasteries, churches, and episcopal centers proliferated under royal patronage, serving as hubs of literacy, charity, and ritual, while also asserting royal influence over territory and communities. The Abbey of St. Denis, established by Dagobert I, became both a royal necropolis and a symbol of dynastic sacrality, creating a lasting association between burial practice, memory, and legitimacy that persisted throughout the Middle Ages. Religious institutions were not passive recipients of royal favor. They actively shaped society by mediating disputes, preserving knowledge, and reinforcing moral and legal norms, forming a collaborative system in which monarchy and church mutually reinforced authority. The Merovingian kings also played a critical role in the formation and codification of law, overseeing the production of written codes such as the Lex Salica, which blended Roman legal heritage with Germanic custom. These codes were both practical instruments and statements of moral and social order, defining property, inheritance, and compensation, while also embedding communal expectations and customary practice into a recognized legal framework. The law under the Merovingians reveals a society negotiating continuity and change, seeking to preserve stability in the absence of centralized enforcement and demonstrating how legal culture can function as both regulation and symbolic expression. Warfare and military organization remained central to Merovingian power, as kings relied on armed retinues, mobilization of free men, and personal leadership to secure territory and enforce authority. Military success conferred legitimacy, redistributed wealth, and reinforced social hierarchies, yet it also demanded negotiation and alliance building with powerful aristocratic families whose loyalty was essential. The 12th continuation of the Merovingian Dynasty series moves deeper into the enduring socio-political, cultural, and religious imprint of the dynasty, examining how the legacy of the long-haired kings shaped the development of medieval Europe, not only in structures of governance but in the collective imagination, memory, and identity of its people. For the Merovingians were not simply rulers of territory, they were architects of norms, symbols, and expectations that endured long after their political dominance ended. By the time the last Merovingian kings were rendered ceremonial figures under the Carolingians, the frameworks they had established, of sacred kingship, negotiated authority, and local autonomy, remained deeply embedded in the consciousness of nobles, clergy, and commoners alike, demonstrating that the influence of a dynasty extends far beyond its temporal power. The Merovingian conception of kingship was predicated on a unique fusion of spiritual and temporal authority, where the physical presence of the king, his long hair, and his participation in ritual, warfare, and justice created a sense of divine legitimacy inseparable from governance itself. This intertwining of religious sanctity and royal prerogative allowed Merovingian kings to command loyalty and maintain order in a fragmented and pluralistic society, and it also left a durable imprint on European political culture, shaping notions of Christian kingship that persisted for centuries. Beyond the throne, the Merovingians cultivated networks of monasteries, churches, and episcopal centers that functioned as nodes of literacy, spiritual authority, and social mediation, linking elite and local interests in mutually reinforcing ways. Monastic communities were not only centers of devotion but also repositories of legal knowledge, administrative expertise, and historical memory, producing texts, charters, and chronicles that preserved the political and spiritual order envisioned by the dynasty. The Abbey of St. Denis, a royal necropolis and spiritual hub, epitomizes the Merovingian approach to embedding dynastic memory within sacred space, demonstrating how burial, ritual, and narrative were harnessed to maintain continuity and legitimacy. Law under the Merovingians reflects a similarly sophisticated understanding of social organization. Codes such as the Lex Salica combined Germanic customary law with remnants of Roman legal practice, creating a framework that regulated inheritance, property, and compensation while reinforcing social hierarchies and communal obligations. Far from being static, these legal traditions were interpreted and adapted locally, producing a negotiated system in which authority was exercised through mediation, ritualized procedures, and the intercession of elites, highlighting the interplay between written code, customary practice, and moral expectation. Military power remained a central pillar of Merovingian authority, yet it was inseparable from relationships of loyalty and reciprocity. Kings relied on the personal allegiance of warriors and noble families, and military campaigns were simultaneously instruments of control, legitimacy, and redistribution, with spoils, land, and offices reinforcing both the social hierarchy and the king's prestige. This interdependence between ruler and aristocracy illustrates a broader theme of Merovingian governance, that power was relational, contingent, and constructed through networks of obligation rather than concentrated in institutions or bureaucracy. Socially, the Merovingian world was remarkably diverse, encompassing Franks, Gallo-Romans, Burgundians, Alemanni, and other groups whose languages, customs, and traditions intermingled under a common political framework. The 13th continuation of the Merovingian Dynasty series examines the profound and multi-layered legacy of the dynasty, tracing the ways in which the Merovingians shaped early medieval Europe not merely through conquest or legislation but through the establishment of enduring political, social, and cultural frameworks that continued to influence generations long after their political power waned. For the dynasty's impact extends beyond the reigns of individual kings to encompass the very structure of European authority, the organization of society, and the conception of history itself. The Merovingians governed a world in which imperial structures had collapsed and local diversity was the norm, requiring a model of rule that balanced personal authority with negotiation, continuity with adaptability, and sacred legitimacy with practical governance. Central to this system was the intertwining of kingship with spiritual and ritual authority, a fusion in which the monarch's physical presence, particularly his long hair, became a symbol of divine favor, dynastic continuity, and moral responsibility, signaling to subjects and rivals alike that power was both inherited and sanctioned by higher order. This symbolic capital allowed Merovingian kings to exercise influence even in periods when their direct military or administrative capabilities were limited, demonstrating the power of perception and ritual in sustaining authority. Succession under the Merovingians, based on partible inheritance, produced both opportunity and instability, dividing territories among heirs in a way that fragmented political authority but also entrenched dynastic loyalty, creating networks of obligation and interdependence that prevented total collapse while generating recurring conflicts that tested the resilience of the kingdom. Despite these challenges, the dynasty's approach to governance fostered remarkable continuity, as regional administrators, local nobles, and religious leaders mediated disputes, enforced customary law, and maintained allegiance, ensuring that the kingdom functioned effectively even amid internal competition. Law and legal culture were central to Merovingian society, combining Germanic customary practices with the remnants of Roman jurisprudence to create frameworks that regulated property, inheritance, and personal conduct while embedding social and moral norms within a tangible legal structure. Documents such as the Lex Salica exemplify this synthesis, providing both practical guidance and moral exemplars that reinforced social hierarchies, community obligations, and the legitimacy of royal intervention. These codes were living instruments, interpreted and applied through local assemblies, dispute resolution, and the oversight of nobles and clergy, reflecting a dynamic interplay between written authority, custom, and social expectation that underpinned the operation of early medieval society. Military organization under the Merovingians was similarly relational, relying on personal loyalty, kinship ties, and aristocratic cooperation rather than institutionalized armies. Success in war reinforced the king's prestige, redistributed resources, and maintained social cohesion, yet campaigns required negotiation with powerful families whose allegiance was conditional and often contested, highlighting the interdependence of king and nobility and the social as well as strategic dimensions of military power. In addition to political and military structures, the Merovingians profoundly influenced cultural and religious life. Monasteries, episcopal centers, and churches acted as hubs of literacy, spiritual authority, and social mediation, preserving knowledge, regulating local behavior, and fostering cultural cohesion across diverse populations. Monastic communities produced chronicles, saints' lives, and charters that embedded dynastic legitimacy within moral and religious narratives, while also transmitting knowledge, ritual practice, and administrative expertise that shaped subsequent generations. The Abbey of Saint Denis stands as a prime example of this fusion, serving simultaneously as a royal necropolis, spiritual center, and locus of dynastic memory, symbolically linking kingship, sanctity, and historical consciousness. Regional identity remained a vital aspect of Merovingian governance, as populations of Franks, Gallo-Romans, Burgundians, Alemanni, and other groups maintained distinct languages, customs, and legal practices within the broader framework of royal authority. Christianity functioned as an integrating force, providing shared moral and ritual reference points, yet local traditions persisted, producing a society in which diversity was accommodated and negotiated rather than eradicated, reflecting the dynasty's pragmatism and adaptive strategy. The 14th continuation of the Merovingian Dynasty series examines the dynasty's influence not only as rulers but as creators of enduring frameworks for European political, cultural, and religious life, exploring the ways in which their governance, ritual, law, and memory established models that shaped society for centuries. The Merovingians ruled a landscape defined by the collapse of Roman administrative structures, the fragmentation of political authority, and the coexistence of diverse ethnic, linguistic, and legal traditions. In this environment, kingship was less a matter of bureaucratic control than a delicate balance of personal authority, ritual presence, and negotiated relationships. The long-haired kings embodied continuity and divine favor, and their presence in public ceremonies, military campaigns, and judicial assemblies served as a visible assertion of legitimacy, demonstrating that power was as much symbolic as it was practical. Authority under the Merovingians was relational, loyalty was secured through networks of kinship, patronage, and reciprocal obligation, while governance relied on aristocratic intermediaries, local leaders, and ecclesiastical figures to implement decisions. Partible inheritance, which divided kingdoms among heirs, both generated instability and reinforced familial allegiance, producing a political landscape in which division was both a source of conflict and a mechanism for sustaining dynastic continuity. Legal culture under the Merovingians illustrates the dynasty's sophisticated approach to social regulation. Codes such as the Lex Salica preserved Germanic custom while integrating Roman legal principles, creating a hybrid system that governed property, inheritance, compensation, and social behavior. Law functioned as a tool for mediating disputes and reinforcing social norms, yet its application was local and interpretive, highlighting the dynamic interplay between written authority, customary practice, and social expectation. Military organization similarly reflected relational authority, as kings relied on the loyalty of warrior elites and noble families, whose support was negotiated through gifts, land, and recognition. Success in warfare enhanced prestige, redistributed resources, and reinforced hierarchical relationships, illustrating the dual social and strategic role of military power in Merovingian governance. Religion and culture were central to the dynasty's strategy for sustaining authority. Monasteries, churches, and episcopal centers functioned as nodes of spiritual guidance, social mediation, and cultural preservation. Monastic communities produced texts, chronicles, and hagiographies that encoded dynastic legitimacy, moral instruction, and historical memory, transmitting knowledge across generations. The Abbey of St. Denis exemplifies this approach, serving as both a royal necropolis and a locus of spiritual authority, intertwining burial, ritual, and narrative to reinforce continuity and legitimacy. The Merovingians cultivated pluralism within their realm, governing populations that included Franks, Gallo-Romans, Burgundians, Alemanni, and others. While Christianity provided shared moral and spiritual frameworks, local traditions, legal customs, and regional identities persisted, creating a flexible model of integration that maintained social cohesion without erasing difference. Women in Merovingian society played significant roles in political, economic, and religious spheres, from estate management and patronage to mediation of disputes and influence in dynastic succession, demonstrating the complex interplay of gender and power. Memory and historiography were essential to sustaining the Merovingian legacy. Chronicles, hagiographies, and genealogies linked political authority to divine providence and moral order, creating frameworks in which the deeds of kings served as instructive models and dynastic continuity was validated through narrative. Gregory of Tours exemplifies this perspective, portraying kings as morally accountable agents whose successes and failures reflected both human action and divine judgment. Material culture, art, and architecture reinforced authority and identity, merging Roman, Germanic, and Christian influences to create a visual and symbolic language legible across social strata. Objects, ritual spaces, and artistic forms communicated hierarchy, legitimacy, and communal belonging, embedding meaning into everyday experience. Regional structures established under the Merovingians, Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy, persisted as administrative, cultural, and symbolic units, shaping the evolution of duchies, counties, and principalities in later medieval Europe. Missionary activity, marriage alliances, and noble networks transmitted Merovingian models beyond the heartland, influencing political, religious, and cultural development across Western Europe. The 15th continuation of the Merovingian Dynasty series brings the narrative to a profound reflection on the enduring structures, symbols, and cultural legacies that the dynasty left in early medieval Europe, highlighting not merely their political or military achievements but the ways in which they shaped the very conception of authority, social order, and historical memory. For the Merovingians were architects of a world in which legitimacy was inseparable from ritual, kinship, law, and belief, and in which survival required both adaptation and the careful cultivation of continuity. At the heart of Merovingian kingship lay a fusion of sacred and temporal power, a system in which the long-haired king's physical presence, ceremonial participation, and moral authority constituted the foundation of political legitimacy. This intertwining of visible symbolism with practical governance allowed the kings to command loyalty and assert control across a diverse and decentralized realm. The dynastic ideology emphasized continuity with ancestors, divine sanction, and personal virtue, creating a framework in which even weak or minor kings retained symbolic authority, and in which the perception of power often outweighed administrative or military capacity. Succession under the Merovingians, organized through partible inheritance, generated both division and resilience, as territories were apportioned among heirs in ways that could produce conflict yet simultaneously embed loyalty and familial obligation, ensuring that the dynasty's influence endured despite political fragmentation. Legal culture was another central element of Merovingian governance, with codes such as the Lex Salica combining Germanic custom with Roman legal tradition to regulate property, inheritance, compensation, and social norms. These laws functioned both as practical instruments for dispute resolution and as symbolic affirmations of royal authority and communal expectations. Local elites, ecclesiastical leaders, and assemblies interpreted and enforced the codes, demonstrating the dynamic interplay between written law, customary practice, and negotiated authority that characterized early medieval society. Military organization, too, reflected the relational nature of Merovingian power. Kings relied on the loyalty of warrior elites and noble families, whose support was secured through gifts, land grants, and recognition. Military campaigns served multiple purposes: consolidating authority, redistributing resources, and reinforcing hierarchical structures, highlighting the interdependence of martial success and political legitimacy. Beyond politics and warfare, the Merovingians profoundly shaped cultural and religious life. Monasteries, churches, and episcopal centers functioned as hubs of literacy, spiritual authority, and social mediation, preserving knowledge, regulating behavior, and fostering collective identity. Monastic production of texts, chronicles, and hagiographies transmitted both moral instruction and dynastic legitimacy across generations, embedding the authority of kings within spiritual and historical narrative. St. Denis exemplifies this integration, serving simultaneously as a royal necropolis, sacred site, and locus of dynastic memory. The Merovingian approach to diversity and integration reflected pragmatic governance. Their realm encompassed Franks, Gallo-Romans, Burgundians, Alemanni, and other groups, and while Christianity provided overarching unity, local laws, customs, and languages persisted, creating a pluralistic society in which difference was accommodated and negotiated rather than suppressed. Women, particularly queens and noblewomen, exercised considerable influence through estate management, patronage, and mediation, shaping political, social, and religious life and demonstrating the interplay of gender and authority. Memory and historiography were central to sustaining dynastic legitimacy. Chronicles, hagiographies, and genealogies linked present rulers to divine providence and ancestral authority, transforming events into moral and political lessons and embedding kingship within a framework of historical consciousness. The dynamics of military obligation highlight the interdependence of king and nobility, illustrating how political authority was co-constructed through reciprocal expectation rather than imposed unilaterally. Socially, the Merovingian period was one of profound complexity, encompassing multiple ethnicities, languages, and traditions. The Franks ruled over Gallo-Roman populations, Burgundians, Alemanni, and other groups, and the integration of these communities required accommodation, negotiation, and synthesis. Christianity provided a unifying framework, yet local customs persisted, producing a pluralistic cultural environment in which authority, identity, and practice were negotiated daily. The lived experience of the population, peasants, artisans, clergy, and nobles, was defined by this negotiation, as people navigated obligations, loyalties, and belief systems in a world shaped by both continuity and flux. Memory and historical consciousness were equally central to the Merovingian project, as the dynasty's legitimacy relied on the cultivation of narratives that linked the present to a sacred and ancestral past. Chronicles, hagiographies, and genealogies constructed moral and political meaning, interpreting events as part of divine providence and reinforcing dynastic identity even when political power waned. Gregory of Tours exemplifies this approach, portraying Merovingian kings as agents of God whose successes and failures reflected both human action and divine judgment, thus embedding moral logic into historical narrative. Cultural production, material symbolism, and narrative memory combined to produce a society in which authority, belief, and identity were intertwined, forming the basis for subsequent developments under the Carolingians and later medieval regimes. The influence of the Merovingians extended far beyond their immediate political domain, shaping concepts of kingship, law, ritual, and memory across Western Europe. Regional identities established under their rule, Neustria, Austrasia, Burgundy, persisted in memory and political geography, while their fusion of Germanic custom with Roman heritage created enduring patterns of law, landholding, and elite culture. Missionaries, monastic networks, and marriage alliances disseminated these ideas beyond the Frankish heartland, contributing to the formation of a shared European cultural and religious space. Even as the dynasty declined and real power shifted to the mayors of the palace and ultimately the Carolingians, the frameworks, habits, and symbols first articulated under Merovingian rule continued to structure political and social life, demonstrating the dynasty's capacity to shape the future long after its formal authority ended. In modern historical perspective, the Merovingians challenged simplistic narratives of decline or darkness, revealing an era of adaptation, creativity, and resilience. Their world was one in which personal rule, ritual authority, regional autonomy, and cultural synthesis combined to produce durable forms of order, and their legacy is evident in medieval concepts of kingship, law, and identity. By examining the Merovingians not merely as rulers but as agents of structural, cultural, and symbolic transformation, their historical significance emerges fully, showing how dynasties can shape societies not only through conquest or administration but through the careful cultivation of legitimacy, memory, and belief. As this 11th part unfolds, the Merovingian dynasty stands revealed as a foundational element in the formation of medieval Europe, a dynasty whose innovations in governance, law, religion, and culture created the conditions for continuity and transformation in a post-imperial world, and whose enduring influence is visible not only in institutions and territories but in the very frameworks of European thought, memory, and identity that persisted for centuries after their last long-haired king was confined to a monastery. The Merovingians, through their ability to negotiate instability, integrate diversity, and embed authority in both material and symbolic forms, provide a model of dynastic resilience, illustrating how societies survive and adapt in the aftermath of empire, and how power, belief, and culture intertwine to shape the trajectory of civilizations over the long term. Their story, viewed in its full complexity, reminds us that history is not merely the record of events but the accumulation of structures, ideas, and practices that endure, often invisibly, shaping societies long after the actors themselves have passed from the scene, and in this enduring presence lies the true weight of the Merovingian legacy in the formation of Europe. Christianity provided an overarching identity that allowed these diverse communities to coexist, yet local practice, memory, and ritual ensured that regional distinctions remained meaningful, creating a dynamic balance between unity and plurality. Everyday life reflected this complexity, as peasants navigated obligations to local lords, monasteries, and the king while participating in the rhythms of agriculture, village communities, and religious observance. Women played varied and significant roles, from the management of estates and patronage of religious houses to the mediation of social disputes and influence in dynastic politics, demonstrating the nuanced interplay of gender, power, and social expectation within Merovingian society. The cultivation of memory was central to Merovingian statecraft, as chronicles, hagiographies, and genealogies linked the present to a sacred and ancestral past. Gregory of Tours exemplifies this historiographical project, portraying kings' deeds as both morally instructive and divinely guided, embedding political authority within a framework of providential meaning. Through these narratives, history became a moral and political resource, guiding conduct, reinforcing legitimacy, and preserving identity even in periods of political weakness. Cultural production under the Merovingians, architecture, liturgy, art, and material culture, communicated authority, identity, and belief across social strata. Roman techniques, Germanic motifs, and Christian symbolism merged in ways that signaled both continuity with the past and adaptation to new realities, demonstrating how culture functioned as both expression and instrument of power. The Merovingian synthesis of diverse influences created a shared visual and symbolic language that reinforced political and spiritual hierarchies while accommodating local variation. Regional and territorial structures established under Merovingian rule persisted long after the dynasty's decline. Former divisions such as Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy retained administrative, cultural, and historical significance, shaping the development of later duchies, counties, and principalities. These regional identities interacted with royal authority, noble networks, and ecclesiastical structures to create a layered, decentralized political landscape that would define medieval Europe for centuries. Memory and legend ensured that the Merovingians remained present even when their political power waned. Figures such as Clovis, Brunhilde, and Dagobert became mythic touchstones, their lives and deeds reinterpreted across generations as moral exemplars, cautionary tales, or symbols of Christian kingship. This process of mythologization highlights the enduring symbolic power of the dynasty and its capacity to shape cultural imagination long after the last long-haired king was dethroned. The decline of Merovingian authority underscores the limits of personal, sacralized power in the face of evolving social, economic, and military realities. The rise of the mayors of the palace, and ultimately the Carolingians, represents not the destruction of Merovingian legacy but its transformation, as the symbolic frameworks, ritual forms, and cultural norms they established were incorporated into a new political order. The continuity of legitimacy, memory, and institutional practice ensured that Merovingian influence endured even under new rulers, demonstrating that dynastic impact is measured not solely by conquest but by the persistence of structures, ideas, and cultural practices. Viewed in long-term perspective, the Merovingian dynasty illustrates the centrality of adaptation, resilience, and symbolic authority in the construction of political and social order. They preserved cohesion in a world marked by fragmentation, blending Roman and Germanic traditions, sacred and secular authority, and local and dynastic loyalties to sustain a functional society. Their achievements provide insight into how human communities navigate the collapse of old orders, negotiate pluralism, and embed meaning into structures of rule, memory, and belief. The Merovingians, through their fusion of ritual, law, kinship, and cultural synthesis, created patterns of governance and social organization that shaped the trajectory of Europe long after their formal reign ended. Their legacy is evident in the political, legal, and religious frameworks of the Middle Ages, the persistence of regional identities, and the enduring symbolic structures that informed medieval thought and practice. As this 12th part of the series concludes, the Merovingian dynasty emerges not as a relic of a lost age but as a dynamic agent of historical continuity and transformation, whose innovations, strategies, and cultural synthesis provided the foundations for European civilization. Their story demonstrates that the measure of a dynasty's significance is not merely in the length of its political dominance but in the depth and durability of its imprint on the societies it shaped, and in this respect, the Merovingians remain central to understanding the formation, survival, and evolution of early medieval Europe. The role of women in Merovingian society, particularly queens and noblewomen, further shaped political and cultural life. Through patronage, estate management, and mediation of social disputes, women exercised influence that extended beyond the domestic sphere, demonstrating the complexity of gender, power, and authority within early medieval governance. Memory and historiography under the Merovingians were equally central to the construction of legitimacy and identity. Chronicles, hagiographies, and genealogies linked political and spiritual authority to moral and divine order, transforming history into a resource for understanding legitimacy, ethical governance, and dynastic destiny. Gregory of Tours, for example, portrays Merovingian kings as agents of divine will, whose successes and failures illuminate the moral logic of rulership and reinforce collective memory, illustrating how history and authority were mutually reinforcing. Material culture and artistic expression conveyed similar messages, blending Roman, Germanic, and Christian influences to communicate political legitimacy, spiritual significance, and social hierarchy. Objects, architecture, and ritual performances encoded authority and belief into the tangible world, ensuring that power and identity were visible and legible across social strata. The Merovingian approach to integration, negotiation, and cultural synthesis had far-reaching consequences for the development of Europe. Regional divisions such as Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy retained administrative, cultural, and symbolic significance, shaping the evolution of later duchies and principalities, while the dynasty's fusion of diverse traditions created enduring patterns in law, ritual, and elite culture. Missionary activity, marriage alliances, and aristocratic networks transmitted Merovingian models beyond the Frankish heartland, influencing political, religious, and cultural formation across Western Europe. Even as political power transitioned to the Carolingians, the frameworks, symbols, and practices established under Merovingian rule continued to structure authority, demonstrating that dynastic legacy is measured not solely by control of territory but by the persistence of ideas, institutions, and cultural norms. Viewed in long-term perspective, the Merovingian dynasty exemplifies the processes by which societies stabilize, adapt, and transmit culture in the aftermath of imperial collapse. Their achievements include the normalization of Christian kingship, the negotiation of pluralism, the embedding of authority in ritual and symbolic practice, and the preservation of continuity across generations, all accomplished without centralized bureaucracy or absolute enforcement, relying instead on networks of loyalty, customary law, and moral persuasion. Their era challenges modern notions of linear progress, illustrating how resilience, flexibility, and symbolic authority can sustain complex societies through periods of instability and transformation. The Merovingians' influence on European identity, law, and governance persisted well beyond the dynastic extinction, shaping medieval concepts of kingship, regional authority, and religious legitimacy. Their legacy endures in the legal frameworks, ritual practices, and cultural narratives that informed Carolingian and later medieval rule, while their memory continued to inspire chronicles, hagiographies, and legends that mediated the relationship between past and present. In conclusion, the Merovingian dynasty represents more than a series of rulers. It is a model of adaptation, synthesis, and enduring influence in a world emerging from imperial collapse. By integrating ritual authority, political negotiation, legal codification, and cultural production, the Merovingians created a society capable of sustaining itself through both continuity and change, providing the foundation upon which medieval Europe would be constructed. Their story, when understood in its full complexity, demonstrates the centrality of legitimacy, memory, and cultural synthesis in the survival and transformation of civilizations, affirming the dynasty's place as a formative and enduring force in the shaping of European history, a force whose structures, symbols, and ideas continue to echo in the legal, political, and cultural fabric of Europe long after the last long-haired king disappeared from the throne. Even after political authority shifted to the Carolingians, Merovingian frameworks, rituals, and symbols continued to structure social and political life, demonstrating that dynastic influence is measured as much by ideas and cultural patterns as by territorial control. Viewed from a long-term perspective, the Merovingians exemplify how societies stabilize and adapt in the aftermath of imperial collapse. Their achievements include the normalization of Christian kingship, negotiation of pluralism, embedding of authority in ritual and symbolism, and the preservation of continuity across generations. These outcomes were achieved not through centralized bureaucratic power but through relational authority, customary law, moral persuasion, and cultural synthesis, demonstrating that resilience and adaptability are central to the survival of complex societies. The dynasty's impact is evident in the persistence of regional identities, legal traditions, ritual practices, and historical memory that informed subsequent medieval governance. Memory, legend, and historiography ensured that the Merovingians remained influential even after their political decline. Kings, queens, and nobles were remembered as exemplars, cautionary figures, or symbols of divine authority, illustrating the enduring power of narrative to shape political and cultural imagination. The transition to Carolingian rule represents adaptation rather than rupture, as Merovingian symbolic, legal, and cultural frameworks were integrated into a new political order. The study of the Merovingians challenges linear notions of progress, revealing that stability, cultural integration, and symbolic authority can sustain societies through periods of uncertainty and transformation. Their governance demonstrates how political legitimacy, social cohesion, and cultural continuity can be maintained in contexts lacking centralized institutions, providing insights into both early medieval Europe and broader human strategies for navigating post-imperial transition. The Merovingians also illuminate the ways in which dynasties shape collective identity and historical consciousness. Through law, ritual, narrative, and cultural production, they created enduring frameworks that linked the past, present, and future, shaping perceptions of authority, morality, and communal belonging. Their legacy is visible in the legal codes, political structures, and cultural norms of the Carolingian era and beyond, demonstrating that the impact of a dynasty is measured not only by its temporal power but by the persistence of its influence in social, cultural, and intellectual life. In conclusion, the Merovingian dynasty stands as a formative force in European history, whose innovations in kingship, law, religion, and culture established the foundations for medieval civilization. Through the integration of symbolic authority, relational governance, legal codification, and cultural synthesis, the Merovingians created a resilient society capable of adapting to change, preserving continuity, and transmitting values and structures across generations. Their story reveals the centrality of legitimacy, memory, and cultural production in the maintenance and transformation of complex societies, affirming their lasting significance in shaping the trajectory of Europe from late antiquity to the medieval period and ensuring that the Merovingians occupy a crucial place in the understanding of historical continuity, adaptation, and the evolution of political and cultural life. Gregory of Tours, among others, illustrated this approach, portraying Merovingian kings as morally accountable agents whose actions reflected both human choice and divine judgment. Material culture, art, and architecture conveyed authority and identity through a combination of Roman, Germanic, and Christian motifs, producing a visual and symbolic language that reinforced hierarchy, legitimacy, and communal belonging across society. Regional and territorial divisions, Neustria, Austrasia, Burgundy, persisted as administrative, cultural, and symbolic structures, shaping subsequent medieval political organization. Missionary activity, aristocratic alliances, and noble networks transmitted Merovingian models beyond the core territories, influencing the broader development of Western European political and religious institutions. Even after the formal transfer of power to the Carolingians, the symbolic, legal, and cultural frameworks established under the Merovingians continued to structure social life, demonstrating that dynastic influence can endure through ideas, norms, and rituals as much as through political control. In long-term perspective, the Merovingian dynasty illustrates the mechanisms by which societies maintain cohesion and transmit culture in the aftermath of imperial collapse. Their achievements include the normalization of Christian kingship, the integration of plural communities, the embedding of authority in ritual and symbolic practice, and the preservation of continuity across generations. These accomplishments were realized without centralized bureaucratic structures, relying instead on networks of loyalty, customary law, moral authority, and cultural synthesis, highlighting the adaptability and resilience of early medieval society. The dynasty's impact is evident in enduring legal codes, regional identities, ritual practices, and historical memory that informed Carolingian and later medieval governance. Legends, chronicles, and genealogies ensured that the Merovingians remained influential in political and cultural imagination long after their political decline, with figures such as Clovis, Dagobert, and Brunhilde remembered as moral exemplars, cautionary figures, or symbols of divine authority. The transition to Carolingian rule represents continuity as well as change, as Merovingian frameworks, rituals, and cultural norms were integrated into a new political order. Study of the Merovingians challenges linear notions of progress and underscores the importance of symbolic authority, adaptability, and relational governance in sustaining societies through periods of transformation and uncertainty. The dynasty's approach to law, ritual, memory, and cultural integration shaped collective identity and historical consciousness, providing the templates for legitimacy, moral expectation, and political authority that would endure throughout medieval Europe. Material culture, art, liturgy, and architectural forms continued to transmit Merovingian ideas, embedding authority, identity, and continuity into everyday experience. Their governance and cultural practices reveal how dynasties create structures and meanings that endure far beyond their political lifespan. In conclusion, the Merovingian dynasty stands as a formative and enduring force in European history. Through the integration of sacred and secular authority, relational governance, legal codification, cultural synthesis, and historiographical consciousness, the Merovingians created resilient social structures capable of adapting to change while preserving continuity. Their legacy is evident in medieval political, legal, and cultural frameworks, in the persistence of regional and dynastic memory, and in the symbolic and ritual forms that structured European life long after the last long-haired king was removed from power. By studying the Merovingians, one gains insight into how societies survive the collapse of empire, negotiate diversity, and embed meaning into structures of authority, law, and culture, demonstrating the enduring importance of legitimacy, memory, and symbolic practice in the formation and evolution of civilizations. Their story affirms that the influence of a dynasty is measured not solely by the territories it controlled but by the lasting imprint it leaves on the social, cultural, and intellectual fabric of the societies it shaped, cementing the Merovingians as central actors in the long narrative of European history, whose impact resonates through centuries of legal tradition, political thought, religious practice, and cultural memory.